Welcome, Wargamers, to the fetid swamps of the mortal realms, because today we are talking about a sub-faction of Nurgle that people are super excited about, even though you can't actually play it in the game, which is super funny. And I speak, of course, about the Order of the Fly. Now, one thing I'd like to add right up top here is if you like this video and you're interested in this faction, please consider using the affiliate link in the description down below. Noble Knight Games is a great store here in the US with discounts on all Games Workshop and various game products. They ship within like a day, max 2, and using that link goes a long way to supporting me, my wife, our cat, this channel, all that stuff, and I appreciate every bit of it. Now, for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar or perhaps Maggotkin of Nurgle as a faction, you may not have heard of these guys because they don't actually show up as a playable, I guess, quote-unquote, faction within the game. Normally, you have your army, Maggotkin of Nurgle, and below that are several sub-factions. So you have like the Blessed Sons and all those kinds of things. Well, our subject today exists only in a lore sense. There's no rules to play them to my knowledge. And yet, they are one of the most compelling sub-factions of the Maggotkin of Nurgle ever put to paper. Now, for the longest time, this faction actually didn't exist in the Maggotkin of Nurgle book. Like, the Nurgle book came out, and then they started writing about the Order of the Fly either during that production or afterwards. And so now when we got this new battle tome, now there's actually a story that includes them, even though they've existed in Black Library publications for some time. And so I wanted to read that one for us today. It's actually on page 17 of the Nurgle battle tome here, and it's called Defiled Chivalry. In the so-called Blighted Duchies of Guran, the Order of the Fly raises its filth-encrusted banners. These knights have long since pledged themselves to Nurgle, honoring a being they know as the Lady of Cankerwall, and setting out on as many gruesome quests to spread sickness and misery across the Jade Kingdoms. Yet their demented ambitions reach beyond Guran's borders. Blightmaster Walgus, one of the prime commanders of the Order, musters a vast host of mortals and demons to march on Shyish. Walgus's army drives hundreds of death-worshipping mortal tribes before them, the survivors forced either to pledge themselves to Nurgle or meet with a most gruesome demise. Though Walgus is eventually slain in the presence of Nagash himself and the crusade shattered, the Order endures, and serves as a grim inspiration for many other Rotbringers to begin establishing their own noxious fiefs. So put very, very simply, the Order of the Fly is a very, very large Nurgle warband, for lack of a better term. It's a whole army. It's like a whole complex, and they have multiple crusades. Like, think of it as like a City of Sigmar kind of a thing, but it's a huge Nurgle army that started off as being a very chivalrous, I guess my mind kind of goes to like Arthurian legend kind of order faction. Everything's knightly, and there's squires, and there's nobility, and household rights, and all these kinds of things. And then Nurgle sweeps in. Now, we don't exactly know how he got, I guess infected, we could say, this society was. It seems like it all comes down to their leader, Lady of Cankerwall. Cankerwall being a place, if I'm not mistaken. It's like a fortress or fortification, and she is the bearer of an artifact known as the Fly-Blown Chalice, which essentially acts as the iconography of the Order of the Fly. They have chalices on just about everything, or kind of intermingled with Nurgle symbols, that kind of stuff. Now, one thing to note is that there are a lot of mentions in multiple of the stories where these guys appear, where it's mortals and demons working together. And that actually makes for some of the most compelling storytelling, I think. It gives you the best perspective of what demons are like, especially when you can, in real time, contrast them with mortals as they're having a conversation. So we're going to touch on some of the books that these guys are in, but just as a heads up, like, I love these guys in the stories. So what sets the Order of the Fly apart from, tons of other Nurgle warbands, right? Because we've seen Black Library stories of champions of Nurgle who have massive, almost continent-spanning wide armies at their disposal, and all these crazy, levels and proportions of things. What makes these guys so special? Well, for one, they're orderly, and that obviously, I know that sounds a little ridiculous given their name, Order of the Fly, but what I mean is, a lot of Chaos warbands just kind of meander around, just going from place to place, conquering in the name of their deity. But what we see with the Order of the Fly is that they have a central location, Cankerwall. They have a core hierarchy that is not based on martial leadership, meaning the Lady of Cankerwall, she's like a seer, a prophetess, she channels the will of Nurgle and all these kinds of things, but she is not like at the front of the lines fighting. This is not a might makes right type thing. There's allegiances that they all have to pledge to one another. They share a common, I guess, mythos with the whole idea of the chalice and that kind of thing. Like, they just are unified in their belief structure, and they have a support system, because one thing that people often forget when they talk about historical campaigns and things like that, I'm just a history buff, I'm going to rant here for a second, is how much work it takes not only to have a crusade, but to keep it going, but to supply it, right? So when you talk about these massive, massive campaigns, like he did this one in Tishai-ish, it required having a support structure behind it. Cankerwall exists, the lady, I'm assuming either sent him out or gave him some form of blessing. But once they started moving, that army needed food, it needed places to sleep, it needed all these kinds of things, and they just kept going and going and going. And so when I say that they are orderly, I mean that they have these support and societal structures in place to make crusades truly devastating, right? Instead of just a roving band of murderers, which is kind of what a lot of Khorne warbands are alluded to, this is something very, very different. This is a kingdom going to war. And certainly one of the defining aspects of their personality, I guess you could say, collectively, is this idea of clarity. And I'm going to use clarity there with a capital C. We see it a few times come up in dialogue through various Black Library books, and it's this idea that in their perception, Nurgle has, opened their eyes to the truths of the world, that everything that they were striving for and fighting for is going to melt away into entropy, and we need to help other people see that. And so if everyone just shared our perspective, everything would be great, which is, I guess, technically true, but it also is never going to happen. And so that's what they're doing. They see themselves as going out and fighting the ignorant and the savages of the realms, trying to enlighten them that they should not be fighting against the inevitable doom that's coming, but rather just embrace it, which is what they're doing. We had discussed before in previous Nurgle videos how that deity specifically, I think more so than any other, warps your perception. In stark contrast to something like Khorne, where a Khorne warlord will see, maybe like an opposing enemy as a challenge to overcome, right? I'm going to offer that skull to Khorne. His perception isn't different. He just does the quick, warlord math of, hey, that's a big skull, I want to put that on my pyramid. But with Nurgle, it is an entire perception shift. That things were gross and nasty and fugly before now become beautiful and harmonious and serene. And so just as certain, monastic knightly orders that we had in our own history are part like warrior, part priest, these guys can be similar in that sense. They see themselves as going out questing, trying to bring enlightenment to the people around them. Of course, that enlightenment comes at the edge of a sword and a whole bunch of nasty Nurgle stuff behind it, but it's how they perceive it nonetheless. Now, normally at this point I would say, there's a lot more going on than just being a Nurgle sub-faction with a sort of knightly, filter on it. But the truth is, there's no way to meaningfully interact with these guys on the tabletop. There's no rules for them. And so instead, what I wanted to do with this section is just talk about some of their achievements, and then we're going to have a discussion on where you can learn more about them, because there are some really cool stories about the Order of the Fly. So as far as their achievements, they are a Chaos Warband that at one point held one of the 8 Lamentations. These are a set of 8 incredibly powerful artifacts. We're talking deity level weapons that exist in the realms. There's actually been a few books written about the various characters of Order trying to reclaim these things. 8 Lamentations. The Spear of Shadows. I think another one is mentioned in the Tainted Axe short story, where we get some of this. But yeah, there's just these mythic level things. The fact that they were able to have one, at least at one point, shows they're out actively doing things. They're scraping across the realms, they're doing everything, they're spreading, they're collecting important artifacts and weapons and bringing them back home to the lady. They launched what they call several Pox Crusades, which are essentially just, their knightly orders going out and trying to bring the good news of Nurgle everywhere they can. And the Necroquake has not really taken any of those territories away from them, which is incredible. I mean, because quite frankly, when the Necroquake happened, there's tons of stories of chaos and order bastions all falling apart because they just got swamped by spirits and undead and all these kinds of things. The fact that they didn't lose any land is quite incredible. They participate frequently in tournaments and jousts and fights at the Varenspire because they are so big and so colossal and so renowned. They constantly get invites from Archaon, or I suppose it's more the Gaunt Summoners, to bring their warriors in to try and prove themselves worthy of becoming a Varengard. And I guess I get the sense that Archaon puts on multiple events and tournaments for these kinds of things, because secondary to that, there was another one called the Black Tourney, that was held in the All Points, not necessarily the Varenspire, but basically it's just a whole bunch of Chaos Knights going at each other, just trying to assert dominance over one another. Now, as far as a faction, like how it presents itself, they are a bit unique in one aspect, and that is, in the Maggotkin of Nurgle battle tome, it seems as though all the factions either lean demon or mortal. Like, there's 3 for each. Whereas the Order of the Fly is unique in that they bring both. They are constantly shown as having plague bearers and heralds of Nurgle, so the demons, working with and talking directly to the mortal elements of their faction, which typically ride around on tainted steeds. I think they're described as in the books. We would probably just use the Pusco Blightlords. And they can have, Rotbringers walking alongside of them, acting as their squires and armsmen. They're shown as having a whole lot of, toad dragon hides on them, so they like to decorate and adorn their armor. And they have this great little line where each of these heroes must quest for and taste the sour syrup of the fly-blown chalice from the Lady of Cankerwall, and only then may they take the 7 times 77 oaths to the King of the All Flies, and that's how they become a part of this, again, knightly order. We know that their original base is in Giran, so they kind of come out of that area. Now, where that is specifically on a map is a bit ambiguous, but there are stories that show their fortress being assaulted by various armies, and it's just massive in its magnitude. So real quick before we get to why I think these guys are so cool and so important, I just want to kind of rattle off some of the places you can read about them. The best source that there is the book Nagash, Undying King, which I think is available in a ton of different formats. I know there's an Audible version, there's obviously the written stuff. It's a great story about the Order of the Fly invading Shyish. It's a complete story, it's a novel, I love it. I'll talk more about it here in a second, but there's also a few short stories. They're included in the Tainted Axe short story. There was a book, I think it's called Legends of the Age of Sigmar, and it has a Sylvaneth on the cover. There's 2 stories in there that involve them, the Resolute and the Outcast. The Outcast is one where I believe that's where they have the Lamentation, that super artifact that they wanted to use against the Sylvaneth. They also make a quick appearance, I believe, in Plague Garden, or at least mentioned there, and have had little tiny entries in things like Scourge of Fate and or Battletome Slaves to Darkness. Just like the little stories that they have, their little 1-paragraph things, and now, of course, within the Maggotkin of Nurgle Battletome itself. And so we've talked about what they are. Essentially, it's a Nurgle warband that's very chivalrous. So why is that so cool? Why do people love these guys so much? I think it boils down to Nagash, Undying King. At least it does for me. That is the first book that I ever saw them in. I can't remember if the short stories came out before then. Maybe Scourge of Fate did, but Nagash, Undying King was it was a fire story where this warband of Nurgle enters in on, again, one of their Pox crusades. And I won't spoil anything for you because I really do want you to read it, but it essentially details a mortal champion working alongside a demon champion. So there's, for the sake of a discussion, let's say it's like a Lord of Blights hanging out with a Herald of Nurgle, and the two have to work together, but they have such different personalities and perspectives. It's actually a book I recommend the most when it comes to trying to understand the differences, or I guess the personality behind demons. Because when you see them contrasted with a mortal and how they speak about things, it makes for some very compelling stuff. And you get to see what a Nurgle warband traveling through Shyish, or what they think of the landscape. And they get attacked by all kinds of crazy monsters and stuff. It's the coolest thing. Highly recommend you read it. But I think really when it comes to the Order of the Fly, the thing that people are really attracted to, I think, is twofold. One is contrast, meaning, that when you look at them, they're filthy and gross and everything's covered in grime, but their perception of the world is that everything is gleaming and shiny. Not in the Flesh Eater Court's way of literal warped perception in that, rather like a delusion, but instead they see this as like, everything's a mission from God. They're going out to try and change the land. They have these noble qualities. And even in one of the short stories, their enemy remarks on, it's like a faction of order is like, man, they just really are people of conviction, which is like a hard thing to have to I gotta give it to them. They have a great sense of honor. It's just a weird thing when you're talking about such an evil warband going around and destroying things. So it's this mix of there is something deeply respectable about them, but it's also shrouded in horror, like just straight up unimaginable horror. And I think that the second reason really why they capture so many people's minds is there's so many nods to Bretonnia in this. Got the Lady of Cankerwall. They're all yelling for the lady. They got chalices on there, all their war banners and that kind of stuff. There's just a lot of sort of not references in the sense of Games Workshop wants you to think that this is what Bretonnia has become kind of a deal, but more like nods to that trope, that classic Arthurian legend kind of thing. And that's super cool because that's a kind of fantasy that so many people are into, not me particularly, but in general, absolutely. Everything that you do from a game perspective can fit into their lore for a Pox Crusade or something like that. And you have this cool built-in belief system. You have plenty of stories to reference if you're curious about that. In terms of number of Black Library publications, these actually have I think 9 or something like that, where they're just kind of mentioned. I mean, the biggest one, of course, is Nagash Undying King, but even within that, you can parse their dialogue and come up with a pretty elaborate backstory for them. They're pretty cool. And it's that little edge of playing a faction or loving a faction that just doesn't have any rules. And to me, that is peak Warhammer, right? When you read something and you're like, that is so flippin' awesome. I want to bring that to the tabletop. And even though there's no way to do that, as far as Games Workshop publications go, the fact that so many people want to is testament to how cool the idea is. Nurgle, but it's not just roving madmen. It's not just people who want to defile and all these kinds of things. It's a seer, so the Lady of Cankerwall herself, creating this illusion of knighthood and honor and oaths and all these kinds of things that we love. I mean, there's so many classic fantasy things there that are there to love, and then just filtering it through a horrific lens. And I think that is one of the coolest things that Games Workshop is really, really good at doing, is just taking a concept that already exists. They didn't invent knightly legends and that kind of stuff, but when you put it through the scope of Nurgle, it just takes on a life of its own. And I love that kind of stuff. I do hope at some point there is some kind of supplement or something like that comes out with rules for them. I would love to see Order of the Fly armies on the tabletop, especially with how great Nurgle is right now in terms of, being so defensive rather than speedy and offensive. I think that it lends itself to the kind of stalwart, we never back up or lose ground story that I think these knights would in their minds be trying to put forward. And so I think what I'm saying is the Battle Tome is at a place where it's very conducive to the Order of the Fly storytelling. I don't really know what they would need to be unique in terms of playstyle. Maybe something to do with how they bring demons in. I don't know. Because again, one of the defining features of them is that they have demons constantly mingled in with their mortals. So maybe there's some synergy or keyword gaps that we can make that would be kind of cool to bridge those two together. Or heck, I mean, if they really wanted to expand it and make it something wholly unique, just grab one of the, what are they called? Maggoth riders and put them in charge. Put Bloab Rotsbond, or there's one of those characters that ride the Maggoth things, and put those in charge of the Order of the Fly, or have them act as an auxiliary thing. Just kind of tie the Order of the Fly into the main Nurgle things here at some point. I'd love to see it. But anyway, friends, that's all I have to say on the Order of the Fly. They are very cool. Go check out Nagash Undying King, and I listed off some other stuff there for you. Figure out why these guys are so cool. I promise you, once you read that book, you're going to fall in love with them. Let me know your thoughts on the Order of the Fly down below. if you have a developed backstory for the Lady of Cankerwall, or why you think her motivations are so dubious, and maybe even how they fell into the arms of Nurgle, I would love to read about it, so throw it in the comments down below. I will respond to you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.